Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I took the vow of silence on a bright afternoon in the roaring Fork Valley, when the mountains looked close enough to touch, and the wind in the aspen groves made a whisper like 1,000 pages turning. At St. Benedict's Monastery outside Snowmass, Colorado, the rule was plain and, to me, merciful. Speak only when necessary. Listen always. A novice learns quickly that silence is neither empty nor easy, only honest. It is a way to live alongside your own thoughts without fear. A way to let the day ring like the bell above the chapel without trying to drown it with your own noise. In my first winter, the bell marked the hours so cleanly that I began to feel the day was a tall column of light, divided into exact stones. Vigils in the cold pre-dawn. Lords as the first thin blue rose behind the peaks. Work periods ringing with saws and shovels. Midday prayer and soup. Vespers like the last sweep of the sun across the ridge. Compline in darkness, softened by candlelight. Then silence so complete it had a shape. I stacked firewood, learned the names of tools, the right sound of a valve closing. I learned where the underground lines crossed the cloister walk, where the diesel tanks were vented, how much fuel the generator burned on a cold night. Brother Matthew, our electrician, a square-shouldered man in his 50s, with hands permanently nicked by copper and habit cloth, took one look at my past life as a maintenance tech in Denver and claimed me for his crew. Wires teach patience, he wrote on a notepad my first week, sliding it across the bench like a humorless joke, and patience teaches God. I answered with a small smile and a nod. The silence was slowly remaking me. If you had asked me then to describe myself, I would have said I was a man learning how to leave well enough alone. Everything I had not said in my life had finally found a home. When the storm came, it came with thunder, which is rare in winter at that altitude. The sky had the green cast of hail as evening mass let out, and we stepped from the nave into the stone cloister to find the wind muscling snow like a living thing. The bell rope swung on its own and then settled. Father Gabriel, our abbot, looked up into the belfry the way a captain looks at a sky full of torn clouds. He raised 2 fingers to his lips, a reminder more than a command. We bowed and made for our chores in darkness that already felt heavy with consequence. The first knock at the gate came a little before 9. We had just finished compline. Candlelight moved along the refectory tables in the hands of novices as we put away bowls and wiped crumbs. The knock was not frantic, not at first. 3 steady raps. Then another 2 after a pause, like someone reluctant to be rude. Brother Anselm, the guest master, lifted his lantern and went. I went with him. On storm nights, we doubled up for the short walk outside so no one was stranded by a fallen branch or a drift. The wind pushed us sideways like a hand. There were 3 of them at the gate, their faces wet and shining with snow and melt. A tall woman in a river guide's wax jacket, with a wool cap cinched down hard, a man in a puffy ski coat holding his arm to his chest like something inside hurt, and an older woman whose face had the practiced calm of someone who has seen rooms where panic would have helped no one. The guide's eyes tracked everything at once. Lantern, walls, cross above the arch, then settled back on Anselm's face. "We're sorry," she said, voice low and steady. "We saw the lights. The roads are bad. He needs a place to sit out the night." Anselm nodded and opened the gate. The guide put a shoulder under the man's good arm and half carried him in. The older woman followed, carrying a zipped medical pouch with the ease of long habit. Guests are not strangers in a monastery. They are reasons for it to exist. We gave them warmth and water before we asked for names. The guide was May, short for Marin, originally from Durango, now working summers on the Arkansas and winters as a snowmaker at Buttermilk. The man was her younger brother, Cal, a lift mechanic. The older woman was Ruth, a retired nurse who had moved to the valley after her husband's death. They had been driving the back road from Basalt when a tree came down in front of them near the Snowmass Creek Bridge. After turning around, they found the highway choked by spun-out cars. The Monastery road had looked passable. That was truth enough. In the guest house kitchen, while the kettle muttered and the storm combed the roof with icy fingers, Ruth unzipped her pouch and examined Cal's arm. The sleeve had been torn and taped haphazardly. The skin beneath was swollen and reddened in a pattern that looked like a bad dog bite or a mechanical pinch. Teeth or metal, I could not tell. Ruth's hands were gentle and businesslike, her fingers measuring heat. "How long since this happened?" she asked quietly. Cal swallowed. "Couple hours." "Any dizziness?" "Just cold." Ruth nodded, stripped gauze, and cleaned the wound with slow, careful motions. Brother Anselm looked at me. I went to find Father Gabriel. We kept the guests in the east wing near the library. The abbot offered them broth and strong tea. In the quiet there, against books that smelled like wood smoke and old glue, their story unwound in fragments. They had heard things on the radio about a sickness in the county, first cases in the city weeks ago, then a few here. Not the kind that gave you a cough and sent you to bed, but something unsteady and strange. People were sleeping all day, then waking at night in a mood like they were listening to a sound the rest of us couldn't hear. Some wandered from their houses without coats. Some stood staring at the interstate overpass lights for hours. There had been a few fights at the grocery store, a crash at the roundabout in Carbondale that turned ugly when a driver wouldn't stop trying to leave with a heavily bleeding passenger. The sheriff's office had sent a bulletin asking folks to stay home if they could and report anyone acting erratic or feverish. Then the power went in town and the radio went to emergency programming. The storm found the weak places in our own lines a little after midnight. The lights hiccuped once. Every window flashed black like a blink, then went out. A heartbeat later, the generator caught with its familiar descending then rising note, and the hall lights came back, softer and warmer. Brother Matthew had already written, "I'll check the ATS," in his pocket notebook, and I followed him down the basement stairs to the utility room, with a flashlight clamped in my teeth. The automatic transfer switch had handled it cleanly. Grid off, generator on, load stable. We were fine for the night. If the roads stayed closed and the diesel ran low, we could stretch it. We had practiced this more than once, replacing coil packs and filters while the rest of the house prayed upstairs. The generators had their own liturgy, no less binding. When I came up from the basement, the wind made a sound under the eaves like a familiar voice too far away to understand. I stood a while in the cloister walk, watching the snow fill the quadrangle. The bell tower rose out of the blowing white like a mast. If I had spoken aloud in that moment, a simple word for the beauty, maybe, or a memory, I think it would have frozen in the air and dropped unbroken to the flagstones. Instead, I made the sign of the cross and went to the infirmary, where Ruth had moved Cal to a cot and was writing notes in a small book by lantern light. "He's running hot," she whispered. "Fever set in quick. Might be just infection. Might be something else." She did not say the word that hovered between us, and I respected that. I had been in enough rooms to know that words can change the shape of what they describe. We gave Cal sips of water with electrolyte powder. Brother Anselm left a small bell beside the cot in case they needed us, with a look that said he knew how absurd that was. Bells in a place where bells rule the hours. At 3 a.m, during vigils, the wind at last lost interest. We prayed the psalms in the dark, our breath like white lace in the beam of a single flashlight set on the floor. In the second row, I could see the profile of Brother Peter, our cantor, who before the monastery had sung in a symphony chorus in Chicago. When he opened his mouth to sing, even now, it felt like a door in the room had been opened that led directly into some earlier century, where music had been carved from stone and lit from within. We finished the last antiphon with a long silence. I felt a small shiver pass down my back. and told myself it was only the cold. In the weak light, the faces around me looked both tired and filled with something steady as rock. After dawn came late and flat. Ruth asked for Father Gabriel alone and closed the infirmary door. When it opened again, the abbot's face looked as if he had just put down a weight he had been holding for years. He lifted his hands a little, the way he did when the words had to be perfect. "For today," he said clearly, looking at us all. "Silence means we are careful with our voices, not that we are blind to need. You may speak to keep each other safe. You may ask for help." None of us had ever heard him phrase it that way. Several of us exhaled a long breath we had been holding without knowing it. He had widened the vow without breaking it. Ruth relaxed a fraction as if a door had opened behind her. By noon, the snow had stopped. A hole in the cloud let down a square of hard light that made the snow look like salt. The diesel's steady thrum had become the new air. We rationed lights, closed off unheated rooms, put a pot of soup on the wood stove in the kitchen so we would not waste electrons. The phone landline was still up. The internet was not. We called Pitkin County Dispatch. A recorded message said lines were busy and gave a frequency to monitor for updates. Brother Matthew brought out the old handheld VHF transceivers from the drawer under the mail sorter, checked batteries and handed them around. "Channel 3 for house," he said. "Monitor the county channel if you're not on duty." His voice, when he used it, had the authority of a man who knew exactly how to wire a large building without getting anyone killed. The second knock came an hour later. It was not asking so much as insisting. 2 skiers, one still in a helmet, stumbled in with a Pitkin County deputy, a young man named Ortega, whose eyes had that narrowed down focus that comes after too many emergencies in a row. The skiers had picked him up at a crash site near the Brush Creek roundabout. He had a small cut high on his cheekbone and a radio clipped to his vest. He smelled faintly of snowmobile fuel. "Windstorm took a stand of trees down all at once," he said, his voice rough with cold and effort. "Power's out up and down the valley. We've got reports of altered behaviour. I can't get my patrol truck down the last half mile. Can you shelter a few more if they come?" Father Gabriel said yes. The deputy nodded once. "All right," he said. "I'll set up at the road with the sled and try to turn people around before they get stuck. If you have to evacuate, use the south trail to the fire road. Don't ring that bell unless you have to." He hesitated, lips pressed together, as if deciding whether to say something unthinkable or let us stay ignorant a little longer. "It draws them," he said finally, very softly. "Sound does." He left into the bright white like a figure carved into light itself and then taken away. In the afternoon, Cal tried to get out of bed with a slow, purposeful insistence that felt more like sleepwalking than panic. Ruth spoke to him in that even tone that makes infants quiet and drunks listen. He did not seem to know her. He blinked in the direction of the window, a tiny flinch when a drift fell from a roof and clumped to the ground. When he looked at the little bell on the bedside table, a shiver passed over his face. His fever was worse. We moved him to the interior room, away from windows and doors. Ruth asked for a cloth and a spoon. She knew what to do. That did not mean she could do it. Brother Peter, bringing a tray, set it down and took one long, careful look at Cal. He then turned to the small wall crucifix, bowed his head for a heartbeat, and walked out, his face stripped of ornament. I followed him into the cloister. He stopped by the frozen quadrangle and rested both hands on the stone sill. "I sang for thousands of people once," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought sound saved lives." He looked at me, eyes steady and bleak. "Maybe it does. Maybe silence does too." That was when the screaming started. It began in the guest house, the sharp crack of a chair falling, then a voice raised in pure alarm. I had not heard a scream like that outside a fire drill in years. The human body can make a noise that goes through your bones and leaves a taste of metal behind. Voices piled on voices. Brother Anselm's urgently calm, May's precise and strong. a third voice raw with pain. I ran with two others, the world narrowing again to a tunnel that contained only doors and the next corner. The kitchen was chaos without heat, a pot half off the stove, a spilled kettle, a chair on its side. In the hall, May stood with her feet planted and a length of mop handle in both hands, like she had always known what to do with such a thing. She was not hitting anyone. She was holding space, the way you might with a frantic dog on a trail until it remembered why it had followed you. Back, she said, low and measured. We're all right. Back. The man in front of her, one of the skiers, the one who had come in with the helmet, made a small sound from deep in his throat, like a person trying to remember how to read and finding only blank pages. His eyes looked both feverish and far away. Blood trickled from a welt on his temple, where he must have hit a countertop. He reached toward the sound of May's voice, not to touch her face, I think, but to find where in the room the sound lived. She rotated her torso and the stick with an economy that would have made any martial arts instructor nod approval, and his hand met wood instead. The pressure of him never became what you would call a strike, but it had direction, and that direction was toward anyone who made a noise. Behind him, in the doorway to the infirmary, Ruth had both hands on Cal's shoulders. He was upright now, swaying just slightly in time with something only he could hear. Brother Anselm was at the far end of the hall, holding the door to the stairwell open with his shoulder, making assurance with his hands. He did not speak. He did not need to. I'm not someone who rushes to force. My instinct is to fix the valve before I break the pipe. But there are moments in a life when a choice can be made in the time it takes to flip a breaker, and the soul either leaps or hides. I stepped forward without thinking very much, caught the skier's arm in both hands near the elbow, and used the simplest leverage I knew to turn him, not away from us, but toward the stair he would have taken if he had trusted someone. I did not speak. May did not either. We put him in motion with our bodies and our quiet, until he was moving down the short steps into the entry, where the cold would be a clearer thought than any we could offer him. When he stiffened at the slant of light from the high transom, I put my weight into him again and eased him along like a stubborn gear. Door, May said then, only the one word, and Anselm opened it. The skier stepped into the courtyard, blinking at the brightness, his breath a small engine. He turned toward the belfry steps in a way that made the hair along my arms rise. Noise. He was following the memory of it, or its echo, or the promise of it. May closed the door quietly behind us. We stood in the small entry, not looking at each other. It is possible to hate a bell for the first time in your life and still know that the thing you hate is also your friend. Cal, Ruth said behind us, a whisper turning into a plea. Cal, no! We ran. In the infirmary, Cal had one hand on the back of the chair and the other on the doorknob, the way a child tests a rule. Ruth stood athwart him with a nurse's unflinching posture that could hold back death for an afternoon. Brother Peter was there with her now, his mouth set in a line that would not sing again today. Cal's pupils were large and slow to track, his skin waxy with sweat. When his head turned toward the window, his jaw made a small working motion like he was trying to free a seed from his teeth. It was the most human gesture I had seen him make since morning. It broke me. Close the shutters, Father Gabriel said from the hall. He had come up behind us without sound and stood there now with his hands folded, not as if in prayer, but as if anchoring himself to the earth. No voices unless necessary. Stay with the sick, those who can. Help Matthew with the generator. I went. Some of us pray by kneeling. Some of us pray by picking up a wrench, and both are heard. Downstairs, Brother Matthew had a panel open and was tracing a conduit with 2 fingers like a man reading Braille. The engine's purr, a comfort last night, had a tired edge now that made me think of thirst. He pointed at the fuel gauge and the chalk marks on the wall beside it. A drift of numbers we updated at every check, like a slow conversation with a creature that begged sugar all day long. We're fine for now, he said. But if the road doesn't open, we'll want to think about the day tank. I nodded. The day tank could be filled from the main tank by an electric pump. If the pump failed, you could fill it with a hand pump, or, in the worst case, by gravity from a bypass line you had to open with a cheetah bar. I had opened it once as a test and felt like I had been handed someone's heart. We made notes on a clipboard and checked the spare filters we kept in a coffee can with the label peeled off. The little habits that keep a house together seemed suddenly as flimsy as someone's list of New Year's resolutions. Still, you keep them. When I came back upstairs, the stormlight made everything look like a photograph taken decades ago. The monastery felt both smaller and more inexhaustible, the way rooms do when they're asked to be more than rooms. The deputy's warning, "Don't ring that bell unless you have to," drew a dark line through the day. Sound drew them. I found myself walking differently, placing my feet in ways that made less noise. I caught myself closing doors the way you slide a book into an already full shelf. Beside the front entry, an icon of the Annunciation, Mary, leaning forward to receive a word, looked suddenly like a woman bracing for the kind of news that arrives without grammar. An hour later, in the refectory, while we ate a lamb stew that tasted of time and determination, the radio on the sideboard crackled, with a clipped voice cutting out on the edges like it was being scraped by the wind. "County to all units. Report of multiple unresponsive individuals on Highway 82 near mile marker 59. Use caution. Reports of unprovoked aggression. Do not approach without backup. Evacuations in progress in Basalt, Snowmass Village, parts of Carbondale. If you are sheltering in place, stay put. If you are on foot," the rest was swallowed by noise. Then it came back. "Repeat. Avoid congregations of sound. Turn off exterior alarms. Use hand signals and written notes if able. We'll broadcast again at 1400. The room held its breath. In our world, you could not have chosen a more intimate instruction. Avoid congregations of sound. We looked at the bell rope as if it were a snake and also a ladder. I went to the library to fetch paper and markers and tape notes at eye level in corridors. Slow, quiet, check before opening doors, write if possible. The letters felt large and foolish, like telling rain to be wet. But writing was the kind of magic even a skeptic could afford. I left the pen near the notes. Others added words in different hands. "You are safe. We are here. Breathe." In the infirmary, Ruth tucked one by Cal's cot that said in her neat schoolteacher's script, "You are loved." He did not look at it. The first attempt to evacuate happened by accident. Brother Tobias, whose joints had been a daily meditation on patience for as long as I had known him, misjudged the step by the sacristy and went down on one knee with a soft grunt that he could not catch in time. A man we had not seen, where he had come from was a question for a day that did not exist, turned his head toward the sound with a slow, intent movement, like a deer catching the downhill drift of a hunter's breath. He was a groundskeeper from a ranch up the valley. I recognized the logo on his jacket and the shape of the mud on his boots. His hands worked like he was remembering how to pick up a tool. His eyes moved past three of us who were still and settled on Tobias, not because of malice, I think, but because the human voice was a lighthouse and his boat had lost its chart. May's shadow moved in the doorway. I have always admired people who, faced with the sudden collapse of the rulebook, find the two rules that remain: keep breathing, keep people alive. She raised her hands, palms out, and made a sort of knot dance with her body. A sideways sway and a step back, a flick of her gloved fingers like an invitation to follow. The groundskeeper's head tracked her, the way a plant will turn toward a window without believing in sun. She took another step, and another, her eyes non-threatening, her mouth set in a line of concentration so fine you could lay a level on it. When she had him in the hallway, she waved us back with 3 quick flicks of her fingers and then eased him down the stairs, one careful tread at a time, like a woman training a young horse to accept a creak. When she came back up, shoulders tight, she drew a rectangle in the air with a finger. Paper. I handed her a folded map I'd made months ago when I was still learning the house. She flattened it against the wall. I had marked the tunnels. A monastery, like any old house large enough to defend itself only by being useful, has two anatomies. The first is the one you see in the guidebook: cloister, chapel, refectory, library, cells. The second is the one you know only if you have ever carried a ladder down a stairwell at 3 in the morning. Crawl spaces and coal grates, steam chasers, access hatches, a bolt with a head rounded by 100 wrenches. St. Benedict's had been built and rebuilt over a century, stone by stone, and idea by idea. Under the cloister walk, a service corridor ran from the boiler room to the kitchen to the laundry and onto the guest house wing. In the old days, Brother Matthew told me, a boiler had pushed steam into pipes sheathed in asbestos and wrapped with prayer. Later, those were replaced by hydronic loops and heat exchangers. But the corridor remained, tall enough in places to walk upright, in others low enough to make prayer compulsory. At the far end, a secured hatch, rusted in a way that suggested both neglect and intention, opened into a short stone tunnel that dead-ended at a retaining wall a few yards shy of the hillside trail to the old hermit cabins. We called it the Sally Port half-jokingly. Nobody had used it in my time. Brother Matthew had once said, with a shrug that covered a library of experience, "If the day comes, you'll be glad you know where the wrench is." Looking at the map now, with May's finger tracing the run, I felt the odd calm that sometimes comes in disaster. The kind that arrives not with relief, but with simple honesty. The day had come. It had not been on any calendar, but it had been approaching since calendars were invented. We were either building a house for it, or we were not. The abbot stood with us. He had the look of a man listening to a hymn only he could hear. When May pointed at the tunnel and raised her eyebrows, he nodded once, as if to bless the idea. "We will move those who can move," he said, each word a stone placed, "and we will carry those who cannot. We will not leave anyone alone. We will use our voices only for what cannot be done any other way." He looked at me. "Keys," he said. The keys hung in the utility room on hooks labelled with a monk's line of capital letters that somehow made any disaster feel like a question of grammar. I took them all, including the bent one that fit the padlock on the old hatch. I loaded a canvas tool bag with a headlamp, a coil of rope, a crowbar with its paint still nicked from last summer's fence project, a pair of leather gloves, a battery CO detector from the boiler room shelf, and the hand pump handle for the day tank in case we needed fuel while somebody else needed light. I added a single shot flare from the emergency kit. We had used them for scaring bears from the orchard, and a sealed mylar blanket, because I had learned once the way cold can steal a person by inches. "Take the farm shotgun," Brother Matthew said, nodding at the locked steel cabinet beside the generator. His voice was neutral and tired. "Slug shells are left. Check the chamber, muzzle down. Keep your finger where it belongs. It's loud, only if you must." I nodded. I had learned the basics long before the monastery, at a range in Arvada, where a patient man had shown me how not to be a danger to myself or anyone else. I loaded the shotgun, kept the safety on, and slung it across my back on a strap. It felt like a confession. I found a small canister of pepper gel in the drawer under the mail sorter, the kind runners use on dogs, and clipped it to my belt. There are gradations of force. One tries not to enter that conversation unless invited. Our plan, if we deserve to say it so boldly, was this: split into 3 teams. One would move through the service corridor, clearing obstacles and setting light. A second would guide the ambulatory, guests and brothers alike, down the stairs and along the corridor to the guest house wing, then onward to the hatch. A third would remain with those too sick to move. When the first wave was through, the third would follow with help. The abbot would go last, because leaders do that in houses where the rules are not easily written on signs. We moved quickly. In the kitchen, someone wrote "exit this way" in block letters with an arrow on a sheet of butcher paper and taped it near the stair. The stairs themselves we carpeted with anti-slip mats taken from the storeroom shelves. I could not have told you where they had come from before we needed them. In the hall, May put on a bright orange reflective vest from the snowplow hook. She said people moved better when they could see who to follow. The deputy came back then, face rimed with ice, eyes sober. "Highway is a mess," he said. "We're staging evac at the middle school in Basalt. If you can get to the fire road, take it down to the electrical substation and then cut right to the old ditch road. Don't ring the bell. The sheriff's office is asking people to kill exterior alarms. We're seeing folks drawn to them." His voice faltered only once, and then it set itself and went on. "I can go with your second group and run point." Brother Matthew cracked a glow stick and taped it to the wall where the corridor elbowed hard left. I put the CO detector around my neck. The corridor had enough turns and enough low ceiling to make bad air not an abstract problem. We left the lights off and moved by headlamps to keep the world small. The walls smelled of damp stone, dust and brass polish. The sense of habit. At the first turn, a stack of old folding chairs had to be shifted, and at the second, we found a leaking valve that hissed like a gossip and would have drowned a knee in an hour. I closed it 2 turns past what I would have liked. The threads would need tape later, and a prayer now. The corridor tightened and dropped. I could hear my heartbeat in the headlamp strap against my temple. In the guest house wing, I unlocked the old hatch. The padlock had the look of a man who had aged too fast. The bent key resisted for a heartbeat, then gave. The hasp lifted with a sound that seemed far too loud and final. Behind the hatch, the tunnel was not dirt, but masonry. 2 courses of stone, a vault above, and a floor that sloped ever so slightly toward the hillside. I had not been in here since the summer I arrived, when the abbot had shown me the house with a kind of sly pride. Here is where we keep the jam jars. Here is where the water meter is. Here is the door nobody talks about. Now the air that moved across my face had the mineral coolness of a cellar that has never been anything else. I clicked the headlamp to its lowest setting and stepped in, counting paces by instinct. 15 to the first bend, then a widening. The wall on the left showed signs of seepage long dried to a ghostly stain. Far ahead, I could hear the dull white noise of stormwater in the hillside drain. Good news, perhaps, because it meant we were not boxed in by ice. I set a light on the floor in the widening, with the beam angled low to avoid broadcasting our existence to the hillside itself. When I turned back, the light made a human-sized shadow on the wall that looked at first like someone waiting patiently for me to finish. It was mine. I breathed out and nodded to the shadow as if we were making a pact and backed towards the hatch. Upstairs, the first group was ready. 3 novices with packs and flashlights, the deputy, May, and me. We went first to break trail, though the trail was stone. Behind us, the second team assembled. Ruth with her small bag and her immense calm. Brother Peter with a blanket over his shoulders like shoulders of a statue. 2 elderly oblates, one of whom kept rubbing a rosary between finger and thumb as if the beads were an abacus that could count our safety like sums. Father Gabriel touched each person's head with 2 fingers. He had no oil and needed none. The deputy went ahead to the hatch and looked out into the white world. He stood a long time with his body still and then turned back, face grim but unsurprised. "We can make it," he said, "but we'll need to be quiet on the hill. Stick to the wall, not the trail. Don't silhouette against the sky." We began. The silence, enforced now by something more immediate than a rule, deepened until it felt like water. Even the old radiators seemed to breathe softer. Moving people is not about force. It is about rhythm and respect. We kept the line close without letting it crowd. At the stair, one of the oblates stumbled. A pair of hands, mine I think, though they felt borrowed, caught him under the arm and steadied him. At the corner with the glow stick, May bent and retaped it so the light would not roll. Details matter even when the world forgets its manners. The first part went smoothly enough that I began to hope for the kind of miracle that leaves no footprints. That is the dangerous part of hope. You begin to forget a storm is not a character in your story, but the author of its own. At the turning of the corridor by the laundry, A noise rolled down the stair like a single stone that decided to be an avalanche. Someone had opened a door on the wrong side. A figure turned into the hall and paused, head tilted, listening. He wore a red puffer jacket, unzipped with a lift ticket swinging on his zipper. He might once have been the man who held the gate for you at Highlands and told you to enjoy the Bluebird Run. Now he looked like a person listening to a piece of music beneath all music. He took one step toward us, and then another, as if checking to see if the floor would hold. "Back," May whispered, a breath against the stone, her hand low and palm out. The line compressed slightly, but did not buckle. The man took 2 more steps. His eyes moved across us all, and then found the smallest motion, the nervous beat of fingers on a sleeve. He leaned toward that, his jaw working very slightly in a way that had nothing to do with speech and everything to do with compulsion. When his shoe scuffed, the sound was a shout. He quickened. I had not wanted to use the shotgun. I had not wanted it even to be part of this house. But there is a difference between refusing and declining. I shifted the strap, clicked the safety like breaking a seal, and stepped forward into the space between the line and the man, because that is what a body is for in a house like this. "Stop," I said softly. One word, the smallest coin of speech. He did not. He moved another step, then another, eyes trying to find my voice the way a hand finds the edge of a counter in a dark kitchen. I lifted the barrel just enough to put its promise between him and us. He reached toward the bore with the slow fascination of a child at a campfire. "Pepper," May breathed. I drew the canister, held my breath for the blowback, and pressed the trigger. A narrow stream arced and struck him in the center of the face with a quietness that felt indecent for its effect. He reeled, coughed, and staggered back into the wall where the corridor turned. He did not voice outrage, only confusion. A person displaced one room from his own life. The line moved again, not faster, but more certainly. The deputy slid past me and put his shoulder gently into the man's chest, easing him toward the utility closet like a bouncer who had taken a vow. I slid the canister back onto my belt with hands that shook only after they were empty. At the hatch, the light was the kind that erases edges. The deputy went first with May beside him. The hillside lay in a white hush. The snow drifted high against the stacked stone retaining wall. The trail to the hermitage cabins, small stone cells built decades ago for retreat, now rarely used in deep winter, ran along the wall for 20 yards before breaking up toward the pines. The fire road cut across the slope above us like a faint pencil line. The creek down in the draw was a muffled murmur under snow. On the far side of the open space, 3 figures stood absolutely still, half hidden by a formation of wind-packed drifts. They faced not us, but the bell tower, which they could not see from here, but which was, nonetheless, where all sound in this valley had always come from. We moved along the wall. Every footfall sounded to me like a shout. My breath felt like a flag. I kept one hand on the stone, not for balance, but for history. The third person in line, the older oblate, made a soft noise as his knee buckled, that involuntary sound a body makes when it finds a sudden hole in its plan. One of the figures across the snow turned its head a fraction. We froze. Time paused, as if to listen too. A gust of wind came down the slope then, and rattled the aspen branches with a dry, papery sound, like someone turning a book page too roughly. The figures turned toward it. The world exhaled. We moved again. At the corner, the deputy held up one finger, wait, and then drifted forward, low and balanced, like a man moving on a boat. He reached the start of the fire road and signaled us with a palm. We followed, a small procession that felt at once ridiculous and holy. We got the first group across. We got the second group moving. In the tunnel, the air had grown warmer by a degree, which meant most likely more bodies in less space, not mercy. I went back for the third group without thinking about whether my legs wanted to. Ruth stood by Cal's bed with a blanket over her arm and that look on her face that nurses wear when they have done all they can and will now do it again. Brother Peter sang under his breath, not a hymn, but the kind of simple line you sing to keep a child from slipping away after a bad dream. It was not the melody itself that calmed, but the fact that someone remembered it. The third group would be the hardest. Cal and another man from town, who had come in shaking and quiet, and then gone softer, like a candle that suddenly thought better of burning. Tobias, whose knee had decided to explain itself now of all days, and Sister Anne, a visiting nun from New Mexico, who had arrived 2 days ago to make a silent retreat and now found herself in the loudest silence of her life. "I know where my center is," she whispered to me, eyes level in a face full of perplexed humor. "I'll walk." We put Cal on a stretcher we made from a folding table and 2 lengths of ladder, with blankets tied through the rungs so nobody fell out. He made a small noise when we lifted him, from pain or confusion, or simply the ache of leaving the shape he had made in the mattress. "We'll be back," Ruth told the room, speaking to the air as much as to the man who would be last. I gave the room a nod like a salute. In a world reordered, respect is one of the few things not on back order. We made the turn by the laundry. The air was stale enough to make the CO detector on my chest chirp a warning, then be quiet. I slowed our pace a fraction. In the hall beyond, the man we had peppered was gone. The closet door hung open a few inches like a mouth that had been told a secret and could not quite close. I felt the hairs along the back of my neck line up like soldiers. The glows ticked their slow green light like insects. At the hatch, the snow outside had changed character. The wind had shifted to the west, bringing a fine, dry drift that made everything look like television static at midnight. The 3 figures across the yard had not moved. I could see now in their stillness the tremor of small muscles along jaw and neck, as if they were clenching against a frequency too low to hear. The deputy and May stepped out into the white again, bodies bent slightly against nothing, and we followed, stretcher steady. It is not a small thing to carry another person. The carrying changes both bodies. Cal's face twitched when the wind kissed it. He made a tiny sound like the beginning of a laugh, which broke my heart in a new way. Halfway to the fire road, from somewhere down the slope by the creek, a sound rose that at first my mind could not pass at all. It was the bell, not ours. A bell down valley, perhaps a ranch dinner bell, or a church in basalt rung by someone who had not heard the order to avoid congregations of sound. It was faint and far away, and yet it reached into the bodies of the 3 figures and turned them like sunflowers. They took 1 step and another. We went still. The deputy lifted his hand again, palm rigid. Stop. The bell rang again, and the 3 figures moved toward it with the careful attention of men crossing a stream on slick stones. I let my breath out very slowly through my nose, as if it were a note I had practiced all my life. When the 3rd step had taken them behind a stand of aspen, we went faster, the line compressing like a snake taking something down. At the fire road, the world regained a logic that did not comfort so much as orient. Trees, slope, a path cut by utility trucks and skiers. The knowledge that humans had been here doing reasonable things last week. We moved along it, careful of drifts. At the bend, where the road curves around the old apple orchard, I looked back once. The bell tower at the monastery was a dark tooth against the sky. I had rung that bell at Lord's the morning of my vows. The rope had felt alive, the wheel above me a living thing. Now I felt toward that tower the way a man feels toward a ship leaving port when he is not on it. We had nearly reached the junction with the ditch road, the old maintenance route for the irrigation canal, when my radio cracked to life with a burst of static that made me flinch visibly. Behind me, I felt the line twitch. A horse shying at a snake in dry grass. "County to any units on Snowmass," the radio said, and then some words I could not catch. Then, "If you are sheltering at St. Benedict's, do not repeat. Do not use the bell. We have reports. Drawn to basalt staging at the middle school. Medical triage at..." Another smear of static. Then the feed died. The deputy's jaw bulged. He lowered his head and set his body again into the grade like a man doing arithmetic until the answer comes out even. Behind me, in the stretcher, Cal made a sound that I thought at first was the start of a word. He had been so quiet that the noise, though small, hit me like a door in the night. I turned my head, and our eyes met for the first time since morning. For a brief, precise instant, the man I had met last night looked out of those eyes like a swimmer breaking the surface to sight a buoy. His lips moved. I bent close. "It's cold," he said, the words grainy as sand. It was an ordinary complaint and also the most important thing anyone had said all day. I squeezed his shoulder. "I know," I said. If I had been a different man on a different day, I would have said more. Perhaps I said exactly the right amount. We reached the ditch road. It ran level, more or less, along the contour. The canal itself half snow, half black water moving like a shadow. The plan was to take it as far as the service road to the substation, then cut down to the highway. The middle school would be set up with cots and coffee, anxious volunteers in vests, the sort of kindness that feels like a splash of water on the face. That picture kept me moving like a rope pulled through my chest. We rounded the bend, where the road passes near the back of a stable. A horse blew softly and stamped. Even the animals knew the world had gone one notch to the left. We heard the bell again, not close, but closer. It came in at the cartilage of your ear, more felt than heard at first, like the alarm your body has for smoke in the house. The deputy stopped dead and held up his hand. The sound came again. My skin prickled. He gestured sharply. Under the trees now, and we stepped off the road into the snow-laden boughs. The line bunched, then found its new shape, then stilled. I could see across the open slope to the highway, and beyond it, a line of vehicles snaking slow as an old wound. Snowplows, pickups, a county truck with flashers, a bus, a Subaru with skis on the rack and no visible driver. In the middle distance, down by a curve where a small road cuts across to a trailhead, a dozen figures stood in the snow, facing the road, heads tilted, as if waiting for someone to speak their name. The bell sounded once more and then stopped. The stillness it left behind felt like a bowl tipped out and still wet. We slid along under the pines, feet careful and quiet. The ditch road turned, and then the substation was below us. Chain link fence rhymed with ice, transformers humming a note so low you felt it in your ribs. The gate stood open. That was not a comfort. The deputy made a face at it like a man meeting an old enemy in the grocery aisle, and then signalled us down the short slope. We went carefully, the stretcher bearers picking steps at a pace that would not spill anyone back into the past. Acrid air hung around the transformers, the smell of heat and dust and voltage. I glanced at the 480-volt signage and felt grateful for every time I had been taught to respect things you cannot see. Past the substation, the ground dropped away toward the highway in a series of shallow benches. We took them, stopping in the lee of a scattering of junipers when the road below convulsed into motion. Trucks forced to move, then forced to stop again. Pedestrians quick with their heads down, the air full of small, important human noises that had once seemed harmless. Down there, sound was life and also bait. The deputy made a quick decision and jabbed 2 fingers toward a line of volunteer pines that would hide us until the very last moment. We went that way. In the second stand, the wind shifted and brought a smell that was not storm or diesel or the clean sting of snow. It was hospital air and unwashed clothes. It was sleeping bodies in a gym where people breathed through their mouths for hours. It was the smell of fear recirculated. We were close to the staging area. I began to hear voices on the wind in that sharp, breathy register that does not belong to any one person, but to gatherings. Over here. Okay, I've got you. Watch your step. No, keep them together. Ma'am, please. No, don't. The deputy did not need to tell us to keep quiet. Silence was now something we wore like an extra layer. At the last low rise, he held us and crawled up alone to look. He lay still for a long time, then slid back with the kind of controlled speed that never happens by accident. His voice, when he used it, was almost nothing. "They're staging at the middle school," he said, "but the lower lot is..." compromised. He looked at me briefly, then at May, then at Ruth. We need to come in from the east side, through the baseball field, fewer people, less sound. I tried to picture it and found that I could. In summer, I had helped mow that field for a charity game. The dugouts faced north. The chain-link fence had a place where a buck rubbed in spring. The backstop had a patch that had been repaired with wire twisted by someone patient. The bleachers had initials carved by teenagers who had not thought, then, that the world would ever end. We could do it. We did it. We slid down the ravine that carried a trickle of water toward the river, then along the back side of the field, where the snow drifted in soft, knee-deep waves. The deputy went first, then May, scanning left and right, hands open at her sides like she was ready to catch or deflect or comfort. In the dugout, huddled together and silent as birds, two kids looked up at us with the enormous eyes of creatures who have seen too much and decided to go on living anyway. Ruth stopped just long enough to touch each forehead with a hand, as if checking a fever, and to say, "We'll send someone for you right now," because telling the truth also sometimes means telling the future and then making it come true. At the east entrance to the school, a volunteer in a yellow vest with a face like a man who had used up his allotment of astonishment 20 minutes ago ushered us in with both arms. Inside, the gym was a neighborhood that had been built in the last hour out of tape and cots and resolve. Carts of bottled water moved like small boats. A woman with a clipboard and a knit hat issued orders in a voice pitched exactly between comfort and command. She saw the stretcher and flicked her fingers toward a curtained area, then back at Ruth's face, then at mine, then at the deputy's radio, and nodded as if to say, "Good, people who know what they're doing." I loved her a little on the spot. They took Cal gently. Ruth spoke in a clear, sparse report. The wound, the fever, the changes, the pepper gel, the brief return of speech. A physician's assistant writing on a laminated sheet raised her eyes at the pepper and nodded approval. Non-lethal, good. Her voice had that clipped, unlovely mercy that holds rooms together. She listened with her whole face. "We're separating by exposure," she said. "Family in the east wing, non-family in the west. If they're drawn to sound, we'll move the loudest functions to the parking lot and keep the quiet ones in the library." She said it like arranging chairs for a lecture that had gotten bigger than expected. The deputy leaned close and murmured into her ear. She nodded and made a mark among a constellation of marks. A hand touched my sleeve. Sister Anne stood there with a look like she had been notched into this day for a long time and had finally fit. "Do you know who rung their bell?" she asked quietly. "Down Valley?" I shook my head. "We were warned not to," she said, and a small dry smile cut the corner of her mouth. "But we are also people. It's hard to learn a new rule when the old one is so old." She looked at me, then through me, then at something far outside the gym that only she could see. "Your bell," she said. "Will you ring it?" I did not answer. My mind ran over the morning like a hand over chords. The vow widened to safety, the tunnel, the figures in the snow, the helicopter we had not heard because none could fly. The bell that pulled at bodies like a tide. To ring the bell would be to gather anyone listening. To ring it would be to end the quiet that had kept us alive. And yet some part of me, old and stubborn, believed that if we did not ring it at least once, the bell would go out like a candle, nobody troubled to snuff. I went to the table where the deputy stood and waited until he looked at me. "I have to go back," I said, my voice both more quiet and more certain than I had expected. "There are two more, and our abbot." He studied my face the way a man checks a map for accuracy. He nodded once. "I'll go with you," he said. "May?" She was beside us already, as if she had guessed the shape of the thought before we spoke. "Let's go," she said simply. Ruth did not try to stop us. She only put a hand on my arm and squeezed, once, a sacrament of pressure. We went back out into the white, everything now familiar and completely different. The bell did not ring. We followed our own tracks up the ravine, along the fence, past the substation. The pines kept our secrets. In the stand above the ditch road, we paused, scanning the open slope. The 3 figures by the monastery were now 5. A 6th moved with a slow, inexorable geometry toward the end of the cloister walk, where the stone wall made a corner. I felt the world tip inside me like a bucket. We needed to be quicker and quieter than there were words for. Halfway along the ditch road, a shape stepped from behind a juniper, a broad man in a black wool coat, hatless, with a scarf flung over one shoulder like a note of carelessness in an otherwise precise outfit. He looked at us without expression and then at the substation, as if tallying the notes of its low, constant hum. He took a single step toward the deputy, who put up a hand with the kind of firmness that does not invite discussion. The man paused, head cocked, not hostile, not anything, only tuned to another station. He turned his head toward the direction of town, then back at us. The deputy made a small circle with his finger, around, and we slid past like skiers passing a tree that had fallen across the trail. In the tunnel, the glow stick had gone to a battery sallow. I cracked another and taped it beside the first. The air smelled old and grateful. In the corridor, by the laundry, someone had written on the wall with the marker in exactly my handwriting, "Quiet is courage." I did not remember writing it. Perhaps I had. Perhaps time had folded. We found them in the infirmary together. Father Gabriel sitting on the edge of the bed, with his hand over the hand of the man we had left behind. Brother Tobias beside the window, his knee wrapped in a brace fashioned indifferently out of an ace bandage and consequence. The abbot looked up as we entered and nodded once, as if we were precisely on time. "One more lesson," he said quietly. "Let's go." We made the same small procession, the abbot at the rear with the quiet that had always been his companion and was now his weapon. At the corner where we had met the groundskeeper, he paused and touched the doorframe with 2 fingers, a man acknowledging a threshold. In the tunnel, he turned his head once to listen to something that had nothing to do with stone. Outside, the figures moved closer to the wall. One stood within arm's length of the hatch, not looking in, eyes on the stone, as if listening to the story it had stored over 100 winters. He made no move when we opened the hatch at finger's width and slid through one by one, like letters in a word that had to be spelled exactly right. When the abbot came to the threshold, the man's head turned the smallest amount, an animal scenting a change in air pressure. The abbot stepped through and closed the hatch behind him, his face calm as a man finishing an old song. We moved. On the fire road, we heard the bell at last in our bones. I knew, without needing to be told, what Father Gabriel had done. He had waited until we were far enough along the corridor to be out of the immediate pull of it, then gone to the side door by the sacristy, pulled the bell rope twice. Not for prayer time, not for a fire, but for a warning that sounded like welcome to anyone who had ever lived in its parish, and then slipped into the tunnel with the rest of us. He had not rung it loudly. He had not rung it long. He had rung it in a way that both answered and obeyed a word none of us had learned yet. I could not have loved him more if he had been my father. It drew them. Of course it did. 3 figures left the yard near the orchard and moved slowly toward the belfry steps, their boots finding the halvings of footprints left earlier by the skier May and I had eased outside. One paused to touch the bell rope where it hung, not to pull it, but to confirm it existed. The gesture was intimate. I felt heat rise to my face as if I had seen something private. A 4th figure came from the direction of the guest parking and took his place at the end of their small procession, like a man arriving late to a concert and taking the last seat without apology. No one gestured. No one spoke. They moved as if a conductor in another building had looked down and lifted a baton. We moved along the wall. The deputy scanned, counted, calculated. The abbot's breath made small white clouds like psalms you pray on beads you know by touch. By the ditch road, the snow gave under our feet with a mechanical sigh. The substation hummed its old note, which I realized with a jolt had the same fundamental frequency as the bell when you rang it softly. Perhaps everything we build that carries us safely is tuned to some human key. Perhaps that is why some people move toward the hum. We slid down the ravine, along the fence, through the trees, into the gym. The woman in the knit hat saw us and nodded once, as if the world had decided not to make a liar of her after all. They took the last man from the stretcher with the tenderness of a group that could not afford any more damage. Father Gabriel sat on a folding chair for the first time since morning and let his hands rest in his lap. He looked very tired. It made him look more like a person and less like a mountain, and I loved him in this shape too. Later, when the long afternoon had settled into a grey that flattened everything and made both hope and despair feel like cheap watercolour, a nurse I did not know came to me with a paper cup in one hand and a folded paper in the other. "He said he knew you'd understand this," she said, handing me the paper. It was Ruth's writing again, neat and unhurried. It read, "If they are drawn to tone, give them tone that doesn't hurt." We moved the loud tasks outside. We made a quiet ward in the library with blankets on the carpet and low light. People who needed to sleep, slept. People who needed to be where there were no sudden noises, sat under an old painting of a river and breathed as if they were learning how. Outside, the parking lot had become a village of problems and solutions. A man changed a snow tire with the focus of a surgeon. A volunteer handed out hot packs with jokes that did not require response. A boy with mittens brought me a candle in a glass jar, as if to say, "Here is something designed not to throw noise." As night folded in, I found a corner near doors and leaned my head back against the cinder block wall. Through the glass, I could see the distant bell tower as a darker shape against the mountain. I thought of the vow I had taken and found that it had not broken at all. We had used our voices the way we use lanterns, sparingly, carefully, in a way that kept people oriented and alive. Silence had not been a rule we followed like a diet. It had been a map we read together without words, a discipline that kept us from stampeding over each other in our fear. The abbot had widened it to include whatever love required. When necessary, we spoke. We spoke like people handling a relic. We kept the words to a minimum. We let them ring. Sometime after midnight, while the gym slept in the restless, exhausted way sheared flocks do after a long drive, I went outside and stood in the three-car shadow of a bus. Snow fell in small, dry diamonds. The air had that Colorado high country clarity that makes you think of stars as stones set in cold silver. Down the valley, far away, another bell rang. 3 notes, then quiet. I raised my eyes to the mountains and thought of the tunnels under our house, the stone under the stone, the corridors that hold the things that let a building live. I thought of the Sally Port that had once been just a story and was now the line on a map that had saved our lives. I thought of the men and women we had left behind in the rooms of the valley, still listening against their will for the note that told them where to go, and I wished them gentler music. When the sheriff's liaison found me, he did it by not making me jump. He approached with the careful foot of a person who knew how to be a good guest. "They're running evac buses to Glenwood," he said without preamble. His face was lined with a day. "If you want, we can put your people on one." "Some will go," I said. "Some will stay. We'll need to get back eventually." He nodded. "We'll make a plan in the morning." He rubbed his forehead with the heel of one hand. "Your bell," he said after a moment, eyes on the dark valley. "I heard it once, when I was a kid, late afternoon, winter." He smiled without humour. "I remember thinking it sounded like a promise." "It was," I said. "It still is. It just means something different today." He gave me a long look that felt like an allowance. "Yeah," he said, "I guess it does." He put his hands into his pockets, not against the cold, but as if reminding them where to rest. I slept in a chair near the east doors. Days blurred into a calculus of small kindnesses and careful losses. We learned to write what we needed to say on whiteboards and hold them up with a little flourish so people would look. We learned to check the windows before we opened a door. We learned the difference between loud that helps and loud that hurts. The bell did not ring again. When the second storm came, 2 days later, it brought with it a clarity like a page wiped clean. The county ploughs cut a corridor on the highway. The National Guard set up a tent city. People found each other. People missed each other. The school became more than a shelter. It became a town hall and a clinic and a chapel for those who needed one. In the library, someone made a space with couches and a sign that said, "Quiet Zone." Beneath it, in a small hand, someone else wrote, "Thank you." A week later, we walked back up to the monastery in a thin winter sun. The snow had a crust on it, like the top of a creme brulee, a hardness that gave and then did not. We went in the front this time. The entry smelled like stone and wood, and the citrus cleaner Brother Anselm favoured. We made a slow tour, not as if looking for damage, but as if greeting a house that had been asleep. The bell rope hung without guile. The corridor lights hummed. The icon by the door had a polish where someone had touched it with a 4-year-old's hand. In the choir loft, I stood under the bell and placed my palm on the wheel. It was as cold as the day I first touched it. I did not pull the rope. I did not plan to for a while, but my hand on the wheel felt like a bargain renewed. The vow of silence was not a quiet at any cost. It was a promise about how we would use our lives in the presence of one another. I had broken it this week and kept it in the same breath. I felt none of the shame I had imagined, only a clean tiredness and a gratitude so bright it felt like drinking cold water when you did not know you were thirsty. That night, while the generator ran in the modest, middle-aged way of a machine that means no harm and does great good, I took my place for vigils and breathed in the dark. Brother Peter sang the old line in a voice softened by a week that had taken and given in what felt like equal measure. In the second row, May sat with hands folded on her knees, posture easy, face watchful. Ruth dozed upright with an expression that told me sleep was a skill like any other. The deputy stood at the back with his hat in his hands, eyes open and careful, as if the world required it of him, and he was content to oblige. The storm had cut us off. The sickness had come into our rooms. The bell had called and we had not answered, and then we had answered and we were still here. The tunnels under the monastery had carried our footfalls like a prayer. We had learned to move with our voices the way we moved with our hands, without waste, without panic, and not without hope. We had learned that silence could not save us. It could only keep us from losing one another on the way to safety. We had learned that what saves us is always, in the end, the exact attention we pay to each other's breath. In the morning, after we had eaten oatmeal thick enough to mend walls and drunk coffee that tasted like a farmer's handshake, I went to the tool bench and put my hand on the crowbar that had leaned there all week with a patient's dignity. I cleaned it with a rag until the paint looked almost new. I wound the hand pump handle with fresh tape. I checked the CO detector and hung it where Brother Matthew would find it. Then I went to the cloister and stood in the square of thin winter sun and listened, not for bells, not for helicopters, not for radios, but for the small, precise sounds a house makes when it warms after a cold night. The stone clicked, the wood eased, the air shifted its weight from one foot to another. "Thank you," I said aloud, to no one and to everyone, and my voice in that court did not feel like a broken rule. It felt like the most accurate word I knew. Then I went to work, because prayer alone won't keep diesel from gelling, and love is a wrench that fits any bolt, and silence, kept or given up, has always been the oldest way to make room for both. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.